It would be much more fun living on the land than on the town street with neighbors so close on each side. And if only Manly were right. Well, she had promised to try the farm anyway. The house on the tree claim will be finished in a couple of weeks. Manly was saying, let's be married the next week. It will be the last week in August and before the rush of harvest begins. Let's just drive over to Reverend Brown's and then go home to our new house. But Laura objected to this because she would not be paid for the last month of her school teaching until October and needed the money for clothes. What's the matter with the clothes you have? Melly asked. You always look nice, and if we are married, certainly that way we won't need fine clothes. If we give Mother time enough, she and the girls will come out from the east, and we will have to have a big wedding in the church. I can't afford the expenses, and your 1 month's salary would not be enough for you. This was a surprise, for Laura had not thought of such a thing. In the wild new country, the folks back east never seemed to be really, and certainly were not considered in the making of plans, but she remembered with something on a shock that Melly's folks back in eastern Minnesota were well off, and that one sister had a homestead claim nearby. They would be sure to come if they knew the wedding dates, and his mother had asked for that in her latest letter. She could not ask her pa to go to any expenses for the wedding. It was all he could do to keep up with the family expenses until there would be some return from their 160 acres of wild land. Nothing much could be expected from the raw sod the first year it was turned over, and his farmland was newly broke. There seemed no other way than to be married suddenly because of the help it would be to have a home and housekeeper in the rush of fall work coming on. Manly's mother would understand and not be offended. It would be thought the right and sensible way to do it by the neighbors and friends, for they were all engaged in the same struggle to establish themselves in the home on the new prairie land. And so on Thursday, the 25th of August, at 10 o'clock in the morning, the quick-stepping brown horses and the buggy with the shining top flashed around the corner at Peason's livery barn, came swiftly over the half-mile and drew up at the door of the little claim house in its hollow square of young cottonwoods. Laura stood at her door, her ma and pa on either hand, her two sisters grouped behind her. They all gaily tried to help her into the buggy. Her wedding dress was the new black cashmere she had thought would be so serviceable, for married women should have a black dress. All her other clothing and a few girlhood treasures had been packed in the trunk and were waiting in Melly's newly finished house. As Laura looked back, Ma, Pa, Carrie, and Grace were grouped among the young trees. They threw kisses and waved their hands. Bright green leaves of the cottonwoods waved too in the stronger wind of afternoon, and there was a little choke by Laura's throat, for they seemed to be saying goodbye, and she saw her ma brush her hand quickly across her eyes. Melly understood, for he covered Laura's hand with one of his and pressed it strongly. The preacher lived on his homestead 2 miles away, and it seemed to Laura the longest drive she had ever taken. And yet it was over all too soon. Once in the front room, the ceremony was quickly performed. Mr. Brown came hurriedly in, slipping on his coat. His wife and his daughter, Ida, Laura's dearest friend, with her betrothed and were the witnesses and those present. Laura and Manly were married for better or worse, for richer or poorer. Then back to the old home for a noon dinner, and in the midst of the good wishes and cheerful goodbyes, once more into the buggy and away for the new home on the other side of town. The first year was begun. The summer wind blew softly, and sunshine was bright where it shone through the east windows that first morning. It was an early sun, but breakfast was even earlier, for Melly must not be late and wept for the threshing. All the neighbors would be there, since they would expect Mr. Webb to give them a good day's work in exchange. As their turns with the threshers came, no one could afford to be late and hold up the gang at Webb's place, so the first breakfast in the new home was a hurried affair. Then Millie drove away with the brown horses hitched to the lumber wagon, and Laura was alone for the day. It would be a busy day where there was so much to do, putting the new little house in order. Before beginning, Laura looked the place over with all the pride of possession. There was the kitchen, dining, living room, all in one, but so nicely proportioned and so cannily furnished that it answered all purposes delightfully. The front door in the northeast corner of the room opened onto the horseshoe-shaped driveway before the house. Just south of it was the east window where the morning sun shone in. In the center of the south wall was another bright window. The drop-leaf table stood against the west wall with one leaf raised and a chair at either end. It was covered with moss, bright red and white checked tablecloth on which stood the remains of the early breakfast. A door A door at the end of the table led into the storm shed, and there was Almanzo's cook stove with pots and frying pans on the walls. Then there was a window and a back door that opened toward the south. Just across the corner from the door into the shed was the pantry door, and such a pantry! Laura was so delighted with the pantry that she stood in the doorway for several minutes, admiring it. It was narrow, of course, but long. Opposite her at the far end was a full-sized window, and just outside the window stood a young cottonwood tree, its small green leaves fluttering in the morning wind. Before the window was a broad work shelf, just the right height at which to stand. On the wall at the right, a strip of board ran the whole length, and in it were driven nails on which to hang dishpans, dish towels, colanders, and other kitchen utensils.